All right, well, thank you for coming. As you can see from the screen, and of course you knew from your program, that the topic is the first of two parts, the post-Christian future, part one, thinking theologically about the utopian impulse as a perversion of the Judeo-Christian worldview. Now, I'll confess that this session, and to some extent the second one, is sort of a thought experiment on my part, because I've had my head in the sequel to the facade for a while now, and one of the trajectories I want to try to chase down is this thing that I'm calling here the utopian impulse. And that's in part prompted by where we are at culturally. It's also prompted by some of the cultural and political trajectories that I see. I mean, what we think of as conspiracy, and I think a lot of it is small c conspiracy, but is not actually new. There's always been sort of this impulse to either create the perfect society or, more pertinently, force it on people. And so I see looming on the horizon a new effort at creating a wonderful, blissful, totalitarian state. And I want to sort of pursue that a little bit and talk about it. And again, for those of you here, for those of you who listen later to the presentation, I just want you to get you thinking about why it is that this always seems to rear its ugly head, and why even Christians at times are not immune from this notion that we can make things perfect, that we can just make it all right. If we did this, that, and the other thing, everything would be okay. So I want to try to think theologically about those things, and we'll see what happens. So here's our roadmap for the day. I'm going to be trying to define what I mean and then give you the elements of utopianism. And then I'll give you some examples, and then we'll move to an evaluation section. And I want to sort of strip away the mask of utopianism and then critique it a little bit, again, theologically, in light of biblical theology, and then talk about how in the world did we get to where we're at, and sort of what we might be looking at. Again, these are going to be broad strokes in this session. In the next session, I'm going to be a little more specific as far as what I think we're going to be having to deal with as a believing community, okay, as the real church in the future. So, first part, definition and relevance. Utopia, as you may or may not know, again, is this idea of a perfect human society. The term itself refers to an ideal place that actually doesn't exist. It's imaginary, it's conceptual, it's this grand wish, something that can't be real in the real world, but boy, we wish it was, that sort of thing. And again, the breakdown for the term utopia, no place, a good or no place. Again, you'll see it spelled either with the E or with the OU, forming the U in either case, but it actually could have either derivation depending on who's using it. And again, an imaginary world where social justice is achieved, whatever that means, and the means of guaranteeing all that are secure. That's where the control comes in. So that's what we're talking about. And as far as the impulse, what are the elements? I mean, if you are utopian in your thinking, what are you thinking? What are you, what's in the forefront of your mind? Now, these things are not all present all the time, but they're all important to different utopian systems. So as far as elements, there's typically an ecological element, and that is the idea that we ought to be existing in a harmonious relationship to nature. And the buzzword, of course, today is sustainability. But there's something to do with humanity's relationship to their environment, okay, to its environment. So something to do with nature, the world, the created order. Some would use the phrase creation, of course, and means something entirely different than what you and I would mean, but again, there's some ecological element typically. There's always an economical element that usually focuses on egalitarian thinking, egalitarian distribution, so that everyone out there is just free from need. Again, we're going to talk about how this is spun and then sort of what the reality always turns out to be. But as we go through these, I want you to be thinking, well, who in their right mind would oppose any of this? Well, in principle, sure, we'd like, we're not in favor of, hey, who all out there wants to rape the environment and pillage natural resources? I mean, nobody's going to say, yeah, let's go at that. And, we wouldn't say, well, my optimal view of things would be that lots of people don't have enough to eat. So there we go. I mean, nobody's going to say something like that. So it's easy to sort of float the idea, but then where the rubber meets the road is always, well, what exactly does that mean and how is it accomplished? Other elements, political, again, this ambition for world peace, again, who would want world war or lots of war? Freedom from crime, again, these are all desirable things. The key is going to be, though, again, how do we define what's a crime and what isn't? What's criminalized and what isn't? And then how do we bring this to pass? What are the enforcement mechanisms? And who's the target? Okay. So there's this political idea, and then there's an equality idea, equal rights, multiculturalism, and of course, gender neutrality, in our day especially, is a big element of this. And again, these things are usually cast or put opposite things like racism and male domination, defined again as something, a situation where earlier in our history women couldn't own property, in the 17th, 18th century, even into the 19th century, didn't have control of their children in a divorce. It was all male favored. So all these things that we'd look at now and say, well, that really wasn't a good idea. So yeah, sign me up for that. Okay. Again, there's a way that it's marketed, but there's going to be a reality to it that doesn't quite conform to the marketing. Progress is a big element, this idea of human improvement, and that can mean improvement of life, quality of life issues, but in our day and age it often means improvement of the organism, okay, in various ways that, again, some of which we would certainly buy into medically. But, again, as I'm going to mention in the next session, part 2, this drifts into other areas that are kind of icky, okay, kind of, things that, probably wouldn't want to go down that road because who knows where that's going to end, and how that's going to go. Science and technology, of course, are always a part of this idea of progress. Then there's a religious element, and this has historically taken 3 forms, one of 3 forms. You either have utopian communities that are anti-religious, and that is, science and nature kind of rule the day. Nature, in effect, is really the substitute divinity. Then you have omni-religious utopianism, where that's basically all religions blend into one, either the effort to create some sort of unified religion or it's in effect a free-for-all. And of course that creates the condition that if you ever raise your hand and object to anything, then you're in the way. Okay, then you're an obstacle to the utopian idea. And you have also had Christian utopias historically. And some of these, drift into, some wacky areas of theology, but others are more communal-centered, and their theology is more or less what we would define as orthodox, but it really had to do with a lifestyle. So there's some variation here. Examples of these elements in practice, again, there are political utopias, where, again, has nothing to do with any sort of religious impulse. There are some Christian utopias historically, and then there are what I would term pseudo-Christian, either things that sort of pass themselves off as Christian, but are theologically aberrant. So you get all different kinds. In the ancient world, Genesis 2 describes a utopia. That would be the one I would vote for, the good one. but it's, again, an ideal state. It's the Edenic state. So that is part of biblical theology. Outside that, though, probably what scholars would point to as sort of the earliest utopian idea would be Plato's Republic. And as we read this in the 21st century, there are things in there that would sort of make us recoil, like, well, that can't be a good idea. But for Plato's day, it was really revolutionary, the ideas that he communicated in here about an ideal society. Augustine with the City of God. Again, Augustine's trying to argue that the world state is not the primary ideal, but again, this city of God as he defined it, Christian community, ruled by God, so on and so forth. And regardless of what you think about Augustine, a lot of what he says in here could fall into the sort of innocuous or theologically abstract category. But a lot of his thinking was used later to legitimize the Crusades, for instance. We have to bring in the kingdom. We have to make the world, our part of the world, we have to make it Christian. We have to make it the kingdom of God. And so that didn't end really well. So it's an example, again, of, we realize that the papacy, of course, is motivating a lot of the Crusades, and it was largely political, but again, it was sort of baptized, using the ideas of Augustine and others. And it just went off in a misguided direction. And I would say in many ways it was misguided from the beginning. 16th century, Calvin's Geneva. I know some of you might be John Calvin fans. And not to take away from Calvin's genius, because he wrote the Institutes when he was 29 years old, didn't have things like concordances and Bible software and stuff like that. So the guy obviously has a lot going on upstairs. But the problem is, if you actually look at Calvin's Geneva, you probably wouldn't want to move there. I mean, he's throwing people in jail for referring to him as Mr. instead of Master. Someone smiles at a baptism, and so that's prison time. And there are all sorts of things that if you read through the history of Calvin's Geneva, it had the feel of an attempted utopia, a theocratic state, run, of course, by Calvin. So there would be some things there that would make us uncomfortable. If you were living in Calvin's Geneva, you had better be a Calvinist, for instance, or it just isn't going to turn out very well. Thomas More, Utopia. This is where the term really entered the regular discourse with More's book. More again is casting this imaginary idea, in part as a critique, for what he saw politically going on around him. But all of these literary attempts, I think are worth reading because on the one hand, they show you what the person's thinking, and boy, wouldn't that be wonderful, and then you turn the page and you get into enforcement. All of them require power. They require power structures to make this work. Because guess what? People are not robots. And no matter how good you make it sound, at some point there's going to be dissent. So what do you do with dissent? Well, we can't have dissent because this is utopia. We have to eliminate that. 17th century, we get Thomas Hobbes with his famous book Leviathan. Again, and this is the book that really focuses on the empowerment, the power situation of the state over people, again, to enforce this sort of perceived ideal community. Francis Bacon, The New Atlantis is really an important book. This one has a significant influence in the United States and America. Because, again, there were many, and it wasn't, you didn't have to be sort of a dyed-in-the-wool Freemason to think this way, but there were many, who would have been outside Freemasonry and just sort of in the Enlightenment discourse that would have looked at America as the new Atlantis. Again, this is the new utopia. We come here to get away from monarchy, to get away from the social ills that we see in Europe. And we get to basically start over. And we get to reimagine what communal life should be, what the ideal state would be. And, when Bacon writes New Atlantis about this imaginary place somewhere else, outside of Europe, that people go to and really start this thing called civilization over again. When people, when America's discovered, of course, by Bacon's time it was known, but when people start to migrate in serious numbers to North America, this is what they're thinking. This is the new Atlantis. This is the great country, the wonderful, country where we get to actually conduct these experiments, in reimagining what life should be like, what the state should be like. 18th century, the Shakers. I'm from the East Coast. I'm from Pennsylvania originally and grew up near the Shaker area, the Shaker community, and the Ephrata cloister. In fact, my first daughter was born in Ephrata, not at the cloister. But the Shakers were a Christian community. So was the Ephrata cloister, but again, Christian. Again, there would be some things going on there that you would sort of would raise an eyebrow, or you might not recognize as Christian. But again, ostensibly, they were not atheists. Certainly, they were not secularists. They're trying to do Christian things. They tend to be very strict in terms of celibacy. I don't think there are any Shakers left anymore. Again, celibacy was part of the problem there. I think the last Shaker died like in the 1990s or something like that. I mean, you can still go see the community, and then of course the cloister. The cloister has more connections with transcendentalism and some of the quasi or overtly kinds of occult things later on in its history. But again, it's not exactly where it began. So you have, again, these sorts of early attempts at, let's go over, we create our own community, we share our own goods in common, we have our own rules for the community, that sort of thing. We separate ourselves, we isolate ourselves from the mainstream way of doing things. The Enlightenment contributes a lot to, again, a utopian thinking. The Enlightenment, of course, terribly important. Again, the age and elevation of reason, human reason. Well, if you're in Europe and, again, you've been living with centuries of monarchy and you don't like aristocracy and you see all the abuses there, the real, strict division of classes and economic states, and you think, boy, we ought to be able to do this better. That we ought to be able to think for ourselves, and we ought to have checks and balances in our government. We ought to have power divided among many, and all these political ideas we're familiar with that actually are sort of launched in the Enlightenment. Well, they launch movements. Of course, we have the American Revolution, which I have listed second here, but chronologically it preceded the French Revolution. The American Revolution was, a violent revolution, but as far as the transition of power and the establishment of power within the community, we had peaceful transitions, from presidency to presidency and so on and so forth. This is why after Washington left office, people were really nervous. Is this actually going to work? It was a big deal that he stepped down after 2 terms. That established the 2-term tradition. It was not written into the Constitution initially. That had to come with an amendment, but when you had the transition to a new leader and the election was really close, like a couple electoral votes, is this going to erupt into chaos and that sort of thing? And it didn't. Now, the French Revolution is quite a different story. What's going on over there? It was on the one hand, we had a guy like Thomas Jefferson over here who was a Francophile. Everybody knows that. And he was on he thought the revolution was great in France until, this isn't like the internet where you get instant information about what's really going on over there. So gradually he starts hearing about, children being guillotined and stuff like this, and Robespierre and all this, and he's like, wow, boy, that's just not really a good thing. I mean, so eventually, it becomes distasteful even to somebody like Jefferson, who was like all things France. But again, both of these things, even though they sort of worked differently and took divergent paths, were fueled by the Enlightenment ideas, again, of building the ideal, the ideal state, where everything's fair, everybody has enough, that sort of thing. 19th century, again, we get Second Great Awakening. I think actually this contributes to utopianism as well because of the rise of post-millennial thinking. And that is, we need to bring in the kingdom so that Jesus can come back. That's what post-millennialism is. Now, post-millennialism in the 19th century was a big deal because, again, we have this, it's hand in glove, or it works in tandem with populism because of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. And the way that industrial revolutions typically work is that wealth, and of course with it, power and political influence comes into the hands of a few, again in the merchant class. I'm thinking of people like J.P. Morgan, Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie. This is the era for that. And again, I'm not saying that everything these guys did was bad, because it wasn't. A guy like Carnegie, felt that it was just immoral to pass on your wealth. So that's why he decided to give it all away. Hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. Not everybody felt the same way as Carnegie. Carnegie, of course, wasn't perfect himself. He had the problem with Homestead and all that. But because wealth is so highly concentrated in the hands of a few, and you get this real disparity between the wealthy elite and then the worker, okay, that creates problems across the board economically for most of the population. So it's a serious thing. And one of those that really suffered were the farmers, because people were moving from the rural parts of the country into the cities because of urbanization. Again, everything's becoming mechanized. You get factories, the whole factory system, the assembly line idea. The demographics in the country are changing dramatically. And the farmers are hurt by that, and they're also hurt by the fact that the money supply is controlled by a very few people. So to get loan, there are instances in the 19th century where you can read that lenders were charging 300% on a bank loan, stuff like that. And farmers need capital to buy land, they need to buy machinery, so they're just getting killed. That all factors into the rise of the populist movement, which is a grassroots movement where, again, we, as farmers unite, we united labor, the farm industry, but then that becomes an appeal, because right down here you have transcendentalism going on at the same time, this sort of utopian idea of wonderful, harmonious coexistence with the land, again, with nature. And so you have in populism, again, these sort of murky ideas of the rise of the masses to create this wonderful, harmonious, state. We want equality. We don't want this distinct classes and social classes and economic classes. And again, we're the farmers. We're the ones that are close to the land. We get our hands dirty, and we ought to be, doing sustainable. All this rhetoric was in place in the 19th century, and so that gets married to this idea of, hey, if we can pull this off, then Jesus can come back, or Jesus will come back. You had postmillennialism as an eschatological system develop during this time. And it actually led to very utopian thinking within the church. William Jennings Bryan's probably the best example. Ran for president, I don't know how many times. He never won. Obviously, probably more famous for the Scopes trial later on. But again, he was a significant figure in this whole era. Charles Finney, okay? Again, post-millennial thinking. It was a big deal. Transcendentalism I've mentioned. Again, Walden Pond, Henry David Thoreau, the Alcotts, Walt Whitman, all these people. This was a more, and I'll use the term pagan approach. And what I mean by pagan is, paganism is at heart is about worship of the earth. It's about this swap out for a personal transcendent deity. We're going to do away with that, and we're going to view nature as our divinity, as our divine focus. It's very monistic. I'll be talking about monism a lot later this afternoon in part 2. The idea that everything is one. nature is God, God is nature, everything that is unified, all this. It's the Oprah theology, of today. So, I mean, all of this talk that we associate with the New Age movement and Oprah and all that sort of thing is transcendentalism, plus a few other threads too. It's nothing new. But there were three communities that were deliberately started in this country that were transcendental utopian communities. Again, it was all about harmony with nature and the ecosystems and all that stuff. Marxism, of course, 19th century, an economic theory, again, really aimed at, quote unquote, leveling the playing field economically and getting rid of all these, class divisions and class warfare to start revolutions to bring in what? A better society, a more, egalitarian, equal society. It's an inherently utopian idea. Again, an economic theory that, of course, takes different forms politically. Edward Bellamy, he was a novelist looking backward. It's just a famous work describing a utopian community that looks a lot like, he imagined himself to be in the year, I think it was 2000. He's writing in the 19th century. And so, again, he's creating this vision for this ideal community, some of it would look, oddly like what we're looking at right now. Again, with some of the control mechanisms and the way things are. But it was a very influential book at the time. 20th century, we get progressivism. We've all heard a lot about that recently. Again, the idea of human progress, all these utopian ideas, it's the same old stuff. Of course, with progressivism and H.G. Wells, with his works, Modern Utopia, Men Like Gods, The Shape of Things to Come, again, utopian ideas. And progressivism and H.G. Wells, of course, a lot of their thinking was influenced by eugenics. Okay, again, to create the ideal society, you need ideal people, right? You need to sort of weed out the unfortunate or less desirable elements to the human population. So that was very common in the United States. A lot of later Nazi eugenic theory and practice was drawn from American and British writing, and those were the seed beds to some of those things that would come later on. Marxist Leninism, of course, this would be the Lenin experiment with Marxism. Of course, the revolution of 1917. Again, the working class. We're going to create the community where the worker is in power. We know how that worked. But again, ostensibly, this is how it's marketed. This is how it's put forth. Huxley's Brave New World was a critique, and some would say a parody of H.G. Wells's utopian visions, because if you've ever read Brave New World, it's sort of the world without pain, really the world without any sort of trouble. It's a utopian vision, but because of some of the stuff in there, what you need to do with people and to people to accomplish this, it's very dystopian. It's very, scary. I don't know if you've ever read Brave New World, but I do recommend it. National Socialism, again, Nazism, again, used a lot of utopian thinking, utopian techniques, utopian goals. They tied race to it, specifically in certain ways. There were certain occult threads that drove their view of the different races. Again, all of these things have more than one thread, but they're all attempts at creating the perfect state. And of course, the perfect state is always in the mind and the eye of the power holder, okay? The one who gets to define all that. Communism, another example. George Orwell, again, Animal Farm and 1984 are obviously critiques of this. 1984, one of the scarier books I've ever read. If you've not read 1984, well, I was going to say I recommend it, but in this day and age, maybe not. It might put you out on the ledge. Somebody would have to talk you off the ledge, because a lot of 1984, you could see, man, you could just implement this really with a snap of your fingers today. But 1984 is really, frightening. And Animal Farm is in its own way as well. again, I recommend both of those. Atlas Shrugged is also a utopian element, even though that's popular with a lot of conservatives. If you've read Atlas Shrugged, and I enjoyed the novel, but I recognize that the author is an atheist, and a lot of her, Ayn Rand's, thinking is certainly contrary to good theology. It's an entertaining read, even though it's 1,000 pages long. It's very clever. But Galt's Gulch is a perfectly utopian community. Okay? If you've ever read the book, you know that. Hippie movement, the 1960s, again, bringing in the age of Aquarius, where everybody's equal and there's no war and all this stuff. Again, the themes are familiar. Of course, the American left, as we know it, grew out of that. And you also have right-wing religious cults. That they're, again, it's utopianism, but just from a different trajectory, a different angle. So, again, none of this is really news, but I wanted to show you some examples anyway, just to sort of put it in your mind of what I'm talking about. Let's talk about what's really behind it. Now, the utopian impulse, again, pre-20th century, again, this is how it's sold, this column over here. And really the modern reality as we've experienced it in the 20th century, and as I believe we will keep on experiencing it in the 21st century. So over here, here's how it's sold. Here's the marketing. Oh, sustainability, shared resources, plenty for everybody, freedom from need. And of course, over here, that means that food is under state control. That's the only way you can accomplish this today. Okay, you have to have the food supply under control. And that means, and it explains why, and I'm hoping a lot of you are aware of this. If you want the copy of the slides, by the way, so that you can get to this link, we're not connected to the internet here, but that link will show you, I think, half a dozen, 7, 8, 10 ways that already the food supply is being really controlled. And things as simple as the family farm are being defined in such a way that they're being criminalized. Okay, this is not accidental. It's not that. I'm still willing to say. I realize there are a few people who absolutely know what they're doing here, but there are a lot of legislators that are frankly clueless in a whole number of areas, and so they think that. I'm doing a good thing by voting yes for this because we don't want people to get sick and on this farm where, things are not controlled and there's no FDA and all. I mean, they think they're doing the right thing, when what they're really doing is they're putting structures in place that will disallow anyone the right to feed themselves. Again, it puts food under state control. There's a movie called Farmageddon. A documentary. Again, that one you might have to be talked in off the ledge, okay, after you watch that. But again, it's this sort of thing. Again, what's happening legislatively. But you have to have this to make this work today. So, food, of course, the Henry Kissinger quote that food is a weapon, of course, is sort of famous or infamous, because we've actually done this, in the Korea and the Vietnam, situations, where part of the strategy was to keep the populations from getting food. I mean, that was just a tactic. So there's population control, there's deliberate shortages. Of course, if you control the food supply, you can put additives in there. You might also want to watch a film called, let me see if I can remember, I can see the cover here in my head, Demographic Winter. Okay, it is an absolute, utter myth that the population is growing too large. The reverse is actually true. And again, this is me. This is Mike Heiser. This is Mike Stick in the Mud Heiser, okay? I am not given to exaggeration. I don't do my research on Billy Bob's website, okay? I do peer-reviewed stuff. And you watch Demographic Winter. They're real scholars, they're real specialists in the fields, and it's very easy to document that we in the West are undergoing a dramatic demographic shift just by, it's just a numbers game. That's why it's called Demographic Winter. Europe does not have the birth rates to sustain its population. we are right on the edge. There are 5 or 6 European countries that are actually under the demographic number required to sustain its own population. Now, the only communities that aren't conforming to that within Europe and within the U.S. and in other parts of the world are the Muslims are the big ones, because it's part of their, it's both part of their religion and part of their political outlook to have big families. In the West, because we're civilized, and we have things like abortion. By the way, demographic winter is the hidden cost of abortion. The victimless crime, it is the hidden cost of abortion. And the people in the documentary actually go through that. How abortion has led to this situation where we cannot sustain our population. So, it gets into all sorts of stuff like that, but there are these shifts going on. And part of that, the reason that made me mentally rabbit trail, is this additive thing. Again, there have been situations where it has been at least suggested, and we can talk again whether, small c, big C, conspiracy kind of stuff, whether it's actually been implemented. Again, that's the controversial part. But the non-controversial part is that it's been talked about and could be done, is you put additives in the food to kill off or to decrease the sperm supply. Okay, essentially, and that reduces, again, the population. Eugenicists are very open that we need lots and lots of people to die off to have, again, to have sustainability. And rather than just sort of advocating, hey, we need a few world wars in succession, that'll take care of the problem, rather than do something like that, it's demographic control that is just far more convenient and effective and frankly marketable. So again, I recommend, Farmageddon, Demographic Winter. There's actually 2. Demographic Winter has a sequel to it too. It's not exciting. It's kind of chilling, but it's good stuff. It's real, it's real scholarship. Political manipulation. Again, if you control the food supply, well, then it's kind of easy to get people to do what you want them to do. Would you like to obey, okay, or not eat? Okay, I'll wait for your answer. It's not difficult to imagine. And again, we have regulations that are keeping people, again, from growing their own food just by zoning regulations. You don't really realize the power of regulation. It's invisible. It's not overt. It's not, in your face. We're manipulating you. But, who wants to go to zoning hearings and stuff like this? It's just boring. Like, I have a life to live. I'm not going to get involved in that. Are you kidding? I don't know if I could even stay conscious. But while we're thinking that, it's just happening. Again, it's just this invisible laying in place of structures that are going to be called upon as precedent later, for certain things. So we'll move on. Ecological, again, here's how it's sold, the harmony with nature, so on and so forth. God is in all the world, that's panentheism, as opposed to God is nature, God is the world, pantheism. Environmentalism. Well, what you get is you get neo-paganism as civil religion, as the secular cultural religion. Again, emphasizing the wonder of nature, the transcendence. Think about the vocabulary I'm using here, because I'm using it deliberately. The transcendence of nature. I just get warm fuzzies, thinking about that. But this is what they're talking about, the idea of an eternal consciousness. Consciousness studies, spirituality, so on and so forth. These things are not new. You also get, in some quarters, scientific materialism as the civil religion. Again, fueled by atheistic natural selection, which when combined with social Darwinism, again, applying principles of natural selection, survival of the fittest, to the way society operates, to classes and class structures. And of course, eugenics is part of that. Nowadays, of course, we refer to eugenics as genetic engineering and genetic selection. Okay, genetics is just the new eugenics. And again, that's not to say I'm not here to demonize all genetic research, because that would just be ridiculous too. But once you have the power of the genome in your hand, eugenics is like really easy. It's just how do we accomplish this thing we can easily do now on a wide scale? That's the only question you need to ask. Politically, of course, world peace, freedom from crime. Who in their right mind would oppose that? Well, I'm not opposed to that. I am opposed to statist fiefdoms that are, if you're a statist, you are anti-individual. Okay, think about that. So that means if you're in control, you get to criminalize practically anything. Criminalize self-protection. That would be like gun laws, taking guns away. Okay, we're going to criminalize your ability to protect yourself. Well, why? Because your emphasis is on the state, okay, the utopia, as opposed to the individual. Citizen self-sustenance, we talked about that with the food supply. There's always, you have each individual state, state being defined as country here, trying to implement their view of perfection here, their view of the ideal situation. But ultimately, you have a push toward global government, and there's lots, this link right in particular here, again, doesn't lead to, sort of a private researcher or something like that. That link will actually lead to an official federal government watchdog entity, like an official media group. It's run through the Heritage Foundation, in fact. So there are people, again, even within groups that the wider culture would recognize as credible, actually keeping their eye on global governance, because they know that it's real. There are really people, lots of people, who want that. And since the Heritage Foundation, again, is focused on principles of individual liberty, they don't want that. So they're keeping their eye, and it's a nice site because it's sort of a gateway or a clearinghouse for lots of information that's official, official documents on global governments, because they collect that stuff and post it on the site. Of course, the UN, which is inherently anti-national, it's inherently global, and Agenda 21, which I don't think we need to really comment any further on, because we sort of all know what that is, but all of these organizations, again, trying to push toward a global state, okay, as opposed to, again, individual national states. Equality, of course, equal rights, multiculturalism, gender neutrality. You Christians are nuts. Don't you want women to vote and all this? You want to go back to the 18th? Again, this is how it's marketed. This is how you're forced into sort of intellectual compliance. But the modern reality is that opposing views on any of these ideas and anything related to them are marginalized, and in some cases there's an effort to criminalize any sort of opposition view. There's an inversion of sexual norms. Basically, nothing is aberrant anymore, because we can all just say it's biology. Again, and we can say that because we now have nature as our God, or scientific materialism as our God. So we have perfectly consistent theology, by saying, hey, it's just biological. Everything's biological. And of course, if you disagree, then there must be something wrong with you. That's a psychosis. Okay. It is funny, but it's really not funny, because again, if you look in some of the scientific literature, especially in psychiatry, they're defining, your resistance to what appears to everyone else as normal and good. That's a psychosis. Okay, try to get health care. And that's just the beginning of how you can be manipulated and pushed into whatever direction. So it's a serious thing. Of course, nationalist culture is going to be vilified, because we need to be multicultural. We need to be global. And so any sense of individual sovereignty, of course, as we saw, is like, well, what's up with that? And naturally, any sense of national sovereignty is going to be viewed as either aberrant or oppositional to the good that the global state could bring. Religion, again, we saw earlier that we have some that are anti-religious, omni-religious, or Christian. Of course, anti-religious in our day and age, we've really seen the rise of what I would call militant atheism, as opposed to nice atheists. You have a lot more militant atheists, again, and they're actually viewed as more reasonable and more tolerant. Tolerant is a big buzzword. More tolerant than a lot of Christians. Why? Because the militant atheist will agree with the gender neutrality thing. It's all biologic. All this stuff. Scientific materialism as the substitute for God. They're going to agree with a lot of these things, and so they actually are marketed or market themselves or are marketed as more reasonable than these stodgy old Christians. Omni-religious, of course, paganism, again, being defined as the elevation of nature to the status of deity. Paganism, the scientification, if that's a word, of the supernatural. Now think about that. I don't know how many of you are into things like, quantum physics and, chaos theory and that sort of thing. I dabble in a lot of that stuff. I'm by no means an expert in it. But one of the things that you're seeing is basically using and things like chaos theory and quantum theory do not of necessity drive the conclusion that there is no immaterial reality. I know lots of physicists personally that understand quantum theory very well, and they're Christians, and they're serious Christians. They don't think it requires a substitute for the truly non-material. I don't like the term supernatural for this reason because it has the word natural in it. But it's not a necessary conclusion. However, there are lots of people who will use the quote-unquote new physics to basically attach a natural explanation to everything you thought was supernatural, everything you thought was immaterial. And if it's all material in some sense, then it's all natural. It's nature. Here we are back again. Intellectually, we complete the cycle to substituting nature, the created world, for the creator, blending them. That's what monism is. Okay? Monism, again, the idea that everything is one and one is everything and all that stuff. There's no creation distinction. Okay? You deny that if you're a monist. So, we have this going on religiously, and of course, anti-Christian basically, unless Christianity adapts to this, especially this in our day. I'm going to talk about this in the second session with what I view as the new Gnosticism. It's going to be criminalized and demonized. Progress, again, human improvement, science, technology. Human control is what this means in our day and age. So, whereas we would call it progress, human improvement through science and technology, what it really means is control of people through science and technology. We have information control. In other words, we'll fill your head with what it needs to be filled with. Knowledge, of course, is power. It's easy to propagandize things like the political process. Eugenics, of course, that's progress because we're weeding out, we're clearing out the gene pool there. Isn't that a good thing? Police state, we have to have a police state to enforce progress. Commerce, of course, comes under state control. I mean, basically everything you do, if it's viewed as being an impediment to progress, then it needs to be controlled or eliminated. Okay, one of the two. I mean, we have to be able to keep the progress going. We don't want progress to stop. Now, utopian impulse as a biblical perversion. And this is where your handout comes in. I'm going to go through this quickly, and I'll tell you what the handout supplements. Here are the fundamental myths of utopianism. The idea that humans are perfectible. Okay, that's a myth. It either on an individual level or a corporate level, it ignores, again, human capacity for evil. It ignores, the condition of the heart. But it's a myth that drives utopianism. The other myth is that you can force human perfectibility. That just isn't going to work. So enforcing an Edenic state, in other words, it would be Eden by human effort. Eden created by a ruling human elite. Again, this is mythology. So human utopias require total control, and they are ultimately dystopias, the opposite of what they claim to be. I would say this is all contrary to a Genesis theological narrative. It's contrary to the meaning of the divine image. Of course, if you've read any of my stuff, you know what my views on the image are. The image is not a thing put in you. It's not a quality. It is a status. It's a status that utilizes the qualities we have as humans. But if you say the image is a quality, then I don't know why you're anti-abortion. Okay, at least prior to brain formation. Because you have no theological argument then. If the image of God is a qualitative ability, I'm sorry, but the single-cell zygote after conception does not have any of that. So if that's your definition, you're in a lot of ethical deep water there. And it would be easy to, undermine your view of abortion. So my view is actually based on a point of Hebrew grammar, which I won't get into here, but the image is a status. We are created as God's imagers. We are to be him. We are to represent him. That's on an individual basis. So inherent within the image idea is the idea of freedom, free will, and individuality. It just goes with the program. Okay? It reflects what God is. Evil and the shared image, again, there's a reason why there are plurals in Genesis. Again, because we are created in God's image, we have free will. Free will is an absolute necessity because it is a communicable attribute of God. If you were not free, if you could not make legitimate moral free will decisions, there is no way you could be like God. And that's the point of the image. You're like him. You would be a robot. God is not a robot. God doesn't share the attribute of robot ability. Okay? It's just nothing like that. It's essential. And so, again, we have this idea of being able to make a decision, that there's freedom here. And of course, that also means that we're going to have evil because people are going to choose poorly. Genesis also democratizes the image. Let us create humankind in our image. Okay, that language in the ancient Near Eastern world is unique because the only people who represented God in the ancient Near Eastern world were who? The ruling elite, the kings. This is why they were conceived, and I mean that metaphorically. They were considered to be either divine offspring or put in their positions by the gods. They were the gods' representatives. Genesis says, no, it isn't just for ruling elite, it's everybody. Everyone is an imager, every human being. And that's very contrary, again, to the utopian idea, because, again, we have to have these power brokers. You always have to have an elite to enforce the utopia. Human imperfection and mortality, again, that is part and parcel of what we read in the Genesis narrative. We are imperfect. We are mortal. We are less than God. We are not gods. Okay, there is no such thing as this perfectibility. The assumption of authority and sovereignty, again, we will be as gods, that whole, again, misguided idea. Again, if you look at what happens in Genesis 3, part of what the serpent says is true. That, when you do eat, your eyes will be open and you will become as Elohim. That's what it says in the Hebrew. You will become as gods. It should be plural there because in verse 22, God says, well, the man and the woman have become as one of us. Okay? There's the plurality there. The idea being that, look, now we have human beings who now have assumed sovereignty. Okay? Whereas God was in control before, and God had laid out his will and said, there's this thing called Eden that you're living in, and wouldn't it be nice to stay here? Isn't this a wonderful place? You can stay here indefinitely, and you eat from the tree of life. You're not going to die. You have contingent immortality because I'm the only being that has immortality in and of itself. But we'll set that aside. Wouldn't you like to stay here and live forever with me? serve me and interact with you. Wouldn't that be great? So, God has this plan for human authority, human shared rulership, with him and other humans and other non-human beings as well in Eden. And that gets corrupted as soon as humankind presumes the right to dictate the terms and to propel the program. So, we have that going on here. And then we have separation from Eden again, and this is really something, absolutely against utopia. Now, your handout is a fuller description of this symbiotic relationship between the biblical view of the divine counsel, God and God ruling through his counsel on earth, the way things should have been, and then once the fall happens, God's continued interaction with humanity, again, through himself and through his counsel. So what you have in those 6 pages, I've drawn excerpts from an article that I really like and would recommend. But they're excerpts that sort of trace the flow through the Bible of that idea. Okay, so that's what the handout is. Babel, again, is a big deal with this because if you understand what's going on at Babel, a ziggurat, Tower of Babel, was built to bring the divine to earth. Okay, we're going to build you a house. We're going to build you a home because gods live on mountains. So let's build our own mountain so that the deity will come here. And then when he comes here, we can negotiate. We can kind of barter. It's the same logic of idolatry. Why do people? The ancient person wasn't an idiot. He knows that this thing he just made isn't his creator. So why do they make idols? Because they believe deities can be summoned to reside there. You locate the deity. This is why Israel was forbidden to make graven images, because Yahweh cannot be tamed. Yahweh will not be brought anywhere for negotiation. That's up to him. Okay, it's a completely different perspective on it. But you have the same thing going on with Babel. We are going to reestablish Eden. We are going to bring the deity back to earth. We're separated from the deity now. We got kicked out and all that stuff. We're going to bring the deity back down to earth, and then we're going to do all this stuff, all this good stuff. Well, again, it's a usurpation of God's plan, God's punishment. Humans trying to remedy and re-kickstart what they ruined. Okay, Babel is sort of the beginning living illustration of this idea that, hey, let's bring heaven to earth. Again, utopian thinking. Heaven is not going to come to earth until God wills it and not before. But that's what the utopian misses or hates. Take your pick, one way or the other. So again, how did we get here? I have to wrap up. We've got all these forces. Again, I'll send you the slides unless you want to watch it on the video again. But we've got all these things going in our culture, all these political movements, out of what I call lemming capitalism here as opposed to philanthropic capitalism. All these things, and really what it comes down to, I like this one, checking our brains out at church. I think that's contributed. And checking the brain out of the pulpit too. All these things have contributed to the future. And here's what I think for sure we're going to be looking at. We're going to be seeing more decline, more statist power, more emphasis of the state over the individual in this country. Technocracy, all these mechanisms used, again, to control information, to control behavior, to control the population. And we're going to see a further marginalization of what we would look at as biblical Christianity. And I think the solution to this is not going to be popular. But this is the proven solution. And that is the church has to be willing to suffer in this generation for the next. It worked the first time. There were 13 people who pulled this off. 12 apostles and Paul. Okay, they won. It worked. But it came at a huge cost. So, I understand we can look at our world and go, what in the world are we going to do? I would suggest that we do what the apostles did. And that is not going to be easy. As Peter tells us point blank here. Paul, do you think Paul knew what he was talking about? We felt that we had received the sentence of death, burdened beyond our strength. All this stuff, despaired of life itself. But that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on the God who raises the dead. We thought we were dead, so we'll depend on the God who raises the dead. Okay, it's not a popular solution. It doesn't involve forming militia groups. It doesn't involve, taking the law into our own hands. But it is the tried and true method. It has worked in the past, and I would suggest it'll work again. It's just going to be a generational thing. So we have to be willing to do that. So that is the end of the presentation. If you want to keep up with me, please follow me on Twitter. It's exciting, let me tell you. More importantly, if you want information about the facade, either the special edition or the sequel, please go to the site there, fasadethebook.com, sign up on the email list so that you get the alerts and the updates. And of course, my contact information is on my homepage too. So, do we have any time at all for questions? Probably not. We can cut it. All right.